The gavel struck once, sharp, final, and then laughter. It spread across the Chicago courtroom like something contagious, low at first, then louder, bolder, crueler. Adeline Brooks stood alone at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting lightly against the edge of worn wood. Her beige coat looked outdated, her posture too calm. Across from her, Calvin Rhodes leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks, the polished face of his Rolex catching the overhead lights. Beside him, Vanessa Clark let out a soft, amused laugh, her fingers brushing the diamond ring on her hand, like it had already replaced everything Adeline used to be. $50,000. Calvin repeated under his breath, just loud enough for the people nearby to hear. That's what 10 years of marriage was worth to you. More laughter. Adeline didn't react. The judge glanced at her one last time. Ms. Brooks, you are waiving all claims to current and future assets. This is a full and final settlement. Do you understand? A pause. The room leaned in. Adeline lifted her gaze, not toward Calvin, not toward Vanessa, but straight ahead. Yes, Your Honor, she said quietly. I understand perfectly. Her voice didn't shake. That unsettled no one. Not yet. Calvin leaned closer, lowering his voice near her ear. You should have fought, he murmured. But you never knew how to play in my world. Adeline finally turned her head. Their eyes met. For a split second, something in hers didn't match the story everyone believed. But Calvin didn't notice, because he was already winning. Then we're done here, the judge said, bringing the gavel down again. Case closed. Marriage erased. Adeline gathered her small purse slowly, deliberately. Behind her, Vanessa's voice cut through the air again. Enjoy your new life, she said sweetly. Try not to spend it all in one place. More laughter. Adeline stopped walking, just for a moment. Then she turned back slightly, her voice soft enough that only Calvin could hear. Make sure you read everything you signed, she said. Calvin smirked. I wrote half of it. Adeline nodded once. A faint smile touched her lips. Exactly. And then she walked out. Behind her, the laughter continued. Louder now, echoing through the room like a victory celebration. They thought they had just watched a woman lose everything. They thought she was walking away with nothing. They had no idea. She had just taken everything from them, and none of them had realized it yet. There was a time when no one laughed at Adeline Brooks, not even Calvin. Back then, they didn't sit across from each other in a courtroom. They sat side by side on a worn gray couch in a small apartment just outside downtown Chicago, sharing takeout and talking about a future that still felt honest. Calvin wasn't rich, not yet. He was ambitious, driven, always talking about bigger rooms and better clients. He wore cheap suits that didn't quite fit and checked his phone too often, even when they were together. But he looked at her differently back then. You see things other people don't, he once told her, watching her work through numbers on her old laptop. That's going to matter someday. Adeline had smiled. She believed him. Because at that time, they were still building something together. Not competing, not hiding, not pretending. She worked as a data analyst, quiet, precise, the kind of person who didn't need attention to feel valuable. Calvin, on the other hand, needed to be seen. And at first, that difference worked. She grounded him. He pushed her. They were balanced. Until they weren't. The change didn't happen overnight. It never does. It started with small things. A new job for Calvin, longer hours, more expensive dinners he insisted on paying for, even when they couldn't afford it. Then came the first real shift. A new office in a glass building near the river. New clients, new expectations, and slowly, a new version of him. He started correcting her in conversations, interrupting her mid-sentence, introducing her differently. "This is Adeline," he would say casually. She used to work in data. Used to, as if everything she had done had already expired. At home, the conversations changed too. Less we, more I. "I built this. I closed that deal. I made this happen." Adeline noticed. Of course she did, but she didn't argue. Because love, when it's real, or when you believe it is, makes you patient in ways you don't even understand at the time. One night, standing by the window, Calvin looked out at the Chicago skyline glowing in the distance. "That's where I belong," he said quietly. Adeline walked up beside him. "We'll get there," she replied. Calvin didn't answer. He just kept staring at the city, and in that silence, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that years later, sitting in that courtroom, Adeline would finally understand. She hadn't been left behind in a single moment, and she had been slowly moved out of his world until there was no place for her in it at all. The first time Adeline realized something was wrong, she didn't say a word. It was a Thursday night. Rain tapped softly against the windows of their apartment, the kind of steady, quiet sound that usually made the space feel warm. But that night, it didn't. Calvin had left his phone on the kitchen counter. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the message that lit up the screen. Adeline wasn't trying to look. She was just passing by. But the name caught her eye. Vanessa. And beneath it, "I can't stop thinking about last night." Adeline froze. Her hand hovered just above the counter, her breath catching before she could even process why. She didn't pick up the phone, didn't scroll, didn't need to. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't need context. It just needs one clear sentence. The front door opened a second later. Calvin walked in, shaking rain from his coat, loosening his tie like nothing in the world had shifted. "Hey," he said casually. "You still up?" Adeline turned slowly. "Yeah," she replied. Her voice sounded normal. Too normal. Calvin walked past her, grabbing his phone without a second thought, glancing at the screen. No hesitation, no panic. Just a quick swipe, and the message was gone. "Long day?" he said, heading toward the living room. Adeline watched him, every movement, every detail, and in that moment, something inside her didn't break. It recalibrated. "You have dinner already?" she asked. Calvin shrugged. "Yeah, met a client." A pause. Then he added, "You wouldn't know him." Adeline nodded. "Right." She didn't ask another question, didn't accuse him, didn't cry, because something deeper had already settled into place. Not denial, not anger, understanding. That night, Calvin fell asleep quickly, one arm thrown lazily across the bed, his breathing steady, undisturbed. Adeline lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain and thinking. Not about what she had lost, but about what she had just learned. Because in that quiet moment, she realized something that would change everything. Calvin didn't think she was capable of seeing the truth. And that was the first real advantage she had ever had over him. The funeral was quiet. Too quiet for a man who had once built things that outlived entire companies. Adeline stood near the back of the small chapel, her black coat pulled close, her hands folded in front of her. There were no cameras, no long speeches, just a handful of people who actually knew who Theodore Brooks had been. Calvin checked his watch, twice. Do we really have to stay for all of this? He whispered under his breath. Adeline didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the closed casket. Her grandfather had never been loud, never flashy. The kind of man who preferred blueprints over conversations, ideas over attention. Most people didn't understand him. That didn't bother him. After the service, a lawyer approached them quietly. "Ms. Brooks," he said, handing her a thin envelope. "Your grandfather left specific instructions. This is for you only." Calvin glanced at it, unimpressed. "That's it?" he said. "No property? No real estate?" The lawyer didn't respond. He just nodded politely and walked away. Outside, the wind cut through the street, sharp and cold. Calvin exhaled, shaking his head. "I told you," he said, adjusting his coat. "People like that don't leave anything meaningful behind. Just ideas and paperwork." Adeline looked down at the envelope in her hands. It didn't look like much. No weight, no thickness, just paper. "You don't even know what's in it," she said softly. Calvin gave a small, dismissive laugh. "I know enough." That was the problem. He always thought he knew enough. Later that night, sitting alone at the kitchen table, Adeline finally opened it. Inside, documents. Dense, technical. At first glance, almost unreadable. But as her eyes moved across the pages, something shifted. Patent filings, ownership structures, trust allocations. Her breathing slowed, then deepened, because this wasn't random. This was intentional. Her grandfather hadn't left her money. He had left her control. Layers of it, hidden across entities, quietly structured, legally precise. The kind of system no one would notice, unless they were looking for it. Adeline leaned back in her chair, the silence of the room pressing in around her. In the bedroom, Calvin slept without a care in the world, completely unaware. She looked at the documents again, at the scale of what had just been placed in her hands, and for the first time, she understood something clearly. The world Calvin was chasing wasn't the one that mattered, because without even realizing it, he had just dismissed the only thing that could ever outrank him. Adeline didn't confront him. Not that night, not the next morning, not even the week after. Instead, she made coffee like she always did, sat across from Calvin at the kitchen table like nothing had changed, listened as he talked about clients, deals, and numbers that sounded impressive, but felt hollow, because now she was listening differently. "You know what the problem is?" Calvin said one morning, scrolling through his phone. "Most people don't understand leverage. They play small." Adeline nodded slightly. "Maybe," she said. He smirked. "You wouldn't get it." She looked down at her cup. Not offended, not surprised, just aware. Because while Calvin was talking about leverage, she had already found it, hidden in legal structures, in patents, in systems he didn't even know existed. Later that day, Adeline sat alone in the spare bedroom, her laptop open, the documents from her grandfather spread carefully across the desk. She wasn't guessing, she was studying, line by line, clause by clause, learning how everything connected. And slowly, very slowly, she began to understand the scale of what she had inherited. This wasn't just wealth. It was infrastructure, control, the kind of power that didn't show itself until it needed to. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Ms. Brooks, this is Margaret Hale. We need to speak regarding your grandfather's estate." Adeline stared at the message, then replied, "When?" The response came instantly. "Now would be best." That evening, she sat across from Margaret Hale in a quiet office overlooking Lake Michigan. Margaret didn't waste time. "Your grandfather didn't leave this to you by accident," she said. "He built it for someone who could think long-term." Adeline held her gaze. "And you think that's me?" Margaret's expression didn't change. "I think," she replied, "you're the only one who hasn't rushed to use it." Silence settled between them. Then Margaret leaned forward slightly. "There's one more thing you need to understand," she added. Adeline waited. "From this moment on," Margaret said, "what you do has to be intentional." Adeline nodded slowly, because she already knew this wasn't something she could reveal. Not yet. Not while Calvin still believed she was small. Because the moment he saw the truth, everything would change. And she wasn't ready for that. Not until she understood exactly how to use it. So she went home that night, sat across from him again, listened to him talk, watched him underestimate her, and chose silence. Not because she was weak, but because for the first time, silence was power. From the outside, nothing about Adeline's life had changed. She still woke up early, still made coffee in the same quiet kitchen, still sat across from Calvin while he checked emails on his phone, barely looking at her as he talked about meetings, clients, and deals that sounded bigger every day. "I've got dinner at the Drake tonight," he said one morning, adjusting his tie. "High-value clients, real money." Adeline nodded. "That's good," she replied softly. Calvin smirked. "You wouldn't enjoy it," he added. "Too technical." She didn't respond, because while Calvin was chasing visibility, Adeline had already stepped into something far more dangerous. In the spare bedroom, her world looked completely different. Her MacBook Air was no longer just a personal device. It had become a command center. Multiple screens, encrypted files, live financial dashboards. Margaret Hale had introduced her to a network of advisors, analysts, and legal architects who didn't ask unnecessary questions. They executed. "Start small," Margaret had told her during one late-night call. "Control structure before scale." So Adeline did. She didn't announce anything. Didn't take risks she didn't understand. She began by activating the patents her grandfather had left behind, licensing them quietly to tech firms that needed them but didn't care who owned them. Money started moving, slowly, then steadily, then consistently. She reinvested everything through layered entities, holding companies, funds that didn't carry her name. By the third month, she wasn't experimenting anymore. She was building. One evening, Calvin walked past the spare room and paused at the door. "You still playing with that stuff?" he asked casually. Adeline looked up from her screen. "Just trying to understand it," she said. He gave a short laugh. "Don't waste your time," he replied. "Real money isn't made like that." She smiled faintly. "Okay." He walked away, didn't look back, didn't ask another question. Because in his mind, she was still small, still irrelevant, still someone who needed to be explained to, and that assumption became the foundation of everything Adeline was about to build. Weeks passed, then months. Calvin's life grew louder, more expensive, more visible. Adeline's grew quieter, more structured, more powerful. And somewhere between his noise and her silence, a gap formed, not emotional, not personal, but financial, strategic, irreversible. Because while Calvin was busy proving he belonged in a world of wealth, Adeline had already begun to own a piece of it. And he still had no idea how far ahead she really was. Calvin didn't see the problem. That was the most dangerous part. From the outside, his life looked exactly like the one he had always talked about. Sharp suits, high-end dinners, clients who spoke in numbers large enough to impress anyone listening. That night at the Drake, the table was full. Crystal glasses, low lighting, conversations layered with confidence, and just enough arrogance to sound convincing. Calvin leaned back in his chair, one hand resting casually near his Mont Blanc pen, the other swirling a glass of expensive whiskey. "This market," he said, lowering his voice like he was sharing something exclusive. "It's all about positioning. You either control the narrative or you get left behind." The men around him nodded. They believed him, because he sounded like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. But belief isn't the same as truth. Later that night, Calvin stood alone on the balcony outside the restaurant, staring out at the Chicago skyline. The wind cut through his coat, sharp and cold, but he barely noticed. His phone buzzed. He glanced down. Another notification, another reminder, another number that didn't add up the way it was supposed to. His jaw tightened. He swiped it away quickly. Then another came, and another. For a moment, the mask slipped. Just slightly, because beneath the surface of confidence, something was cracking. The firm wasn't as stable as he claimed. Deals were delayed. Clients were asking more questions. And the leverage he loved talking about so much was starting to turn against him. Inside, the laughter continued. But out here, it was quiet. Too quiet. Calvin exhaled slowly, forcing control back into his expression before stepping inside again. By the time he returned to the table, the version of him everyone expected was back. Polished, confident, untouchable. But something had shifted, and somewhere else in the city. Adeline was already aware of it. She sat in front of her laptop, a different set of numbers reflecting across the screen. Not guesses, not assumptions. Data, clean, precise. She had been watching for weeks. Patterns, cash flow inconsistencies, hidden liabilities buried under layers of presentation. She didn't react, didn't rush. She just observed. Because now, she understood something Calvin didn't. He wasn't building anymore. He was covering. And people who spend too much time covering eventually run out of things to hide behind. Adeline closed her laptop slowly, her expression calm, focused, certain, because the man who thought he was rising was already falling, and he still believed he was in control. Adeline didn't confront the numbers. She studied them. That was the difference. Late that night, the city outside her window blurred into a quiet reflection of lights across the glass. Inside, her screen displayed something far more revealing than anything Calvin had ever said out loud. Cash flow irregularities, short-term debt disguised as long-term positioning, client funds moving in patterns that didn't match the narratives he sold at dinner tables. She leaned back slightly, her fingers resting on the edge of her MacBook Air. Not surprised, just certain. A soft notification appeared on her screen. Secure line. Margaret Hale. Tell me what you see," Margaret said as soon as the call connected. Adeline didn't rush her answer. "He's over-leveraged," she said calmly. "Not just stretched, dependent. If one deal collapses, everything follows." Margaret was silent for a moment. Then, "And the offshore accounts?" Adeline clicked open another file. "They exist," she replied. "Small, fragmented, not enough to save him, just enough to hide what he doesn't want seen." Another pause. Longer this time. "He doesn't know you know," Margaret said. Adeline's eyes didn't leave the screen. "No," she answered. "And that's the only reason this works." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncertainty. It was alignment. Because this wasn't just observation anymore. This was positioning. "He's going to try to protect himself," Margaret continued. If pressure builds, he'll move fast. Legal structures, asset shielding, possibly divorce. Adeline closed the file slowly. I know, she said. Her voice didn't change, didn't harden, but something inside it did. Resolve. Then we don't stop him? Margaret said quietly. Adeline nodded, even though Margaret couldn't see her. We guide him, she replied. That was the moment everything shifted. Not when Calvin cheated, not when he underestimated her, but right here, when she chose not to react, but to let him walk exactly where she needed him to go. Across the city, Calvin sat in his office, unaware, reviewing contracts, planning his next move, believing he was still ahead. Adeline closed her laptop. The room fell silent, but her mind didn't, because now, she wasn't just watching his world, she was already inside it. And step by step, without him ever noticing, she was beginning to control it. Adeline didn't wait for the divorce. She prepared for it. By the time Calvin finally brought it up, everything was already in place. It happened on a quiet evening. No shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Just a controlled conversation across a dining table that had long stopped feeling like home. This isn't working anymore, Calvin said, not even looking at her as he spoke. We've grown in different directions. Adeline nodded slowly. I see, she replied. Her calmness caught him off guard, but only for a second. I think it's better if we handle this cleanly, he continued. No complications. No unnecessary conflict. Clean. That word mattered. Adeline folded her hands lightly. What does that look like to you? She asked. Calvin leaned back, confident now. A simple settlement, he said. You take a fixed amount, we separate assets clearly, and we move on. No hesitation, no guilt, just efficiency. Adeline held his gaze. And the company? She asked. Calvin smirked slightly. That was never yours. The answer came too quickly, too easily, exactly as she expected. Adeline nodded once. All right, she said. That was it. No argument, no negotiation, no emotion. Calvin blinked. That's it? He asked. Adeline tilted her head slightly. You said you wanted it clean, she replied. He studied her for a moment, trying to find something beneath the surface, but there was nothing he could read. Because she wasn't reacting anymore. She was guiding. Good, he said finally. Then we'll have the lawyers draft everything. Adeline stood, collecting her plate. Make sure they include a full separation clause, she added calmly. Calvin frowned. What do you mean? No future claims, she said. On either side. He watched her carefully now. Suspicion flickered, but didn't stay. Because in his mind, she still didn't understand what she was giving up. That won't be a problem, he replied. Adeline nodded. I didn't think it would be. Later that night, she sat alone in the spare room again. Her screen lit up. A call from Margaret. Did he ask for it? Margaret's voice came through. Adeline allowed herself the smallest pause. Then, yes, she said. And the clause? He'll insist on it. Margaret exhaled softly. Then it's done. Adeline looked at the documents already prepared on her screen. Structured, precise, final. Because this wasn't a reaction to a failing marriage. It was the execution of a plan. And Calvin, believing he was the one ending things, had just walked directly into it. Exactly as she needed him to. Without ever realizing, the divorce wasn't his decision, it was hers. When Calvin chose the law firm, he didn't hesitate. Top tier, expensive, aggressive. Exactly the kind of representation that matched the image he had spent years building. Adeline didn't argue. That was the part that made it easy. I'll have someone handle my side, she said simply. Calvin barely looked up from his phone. Just make sure they don't complicate things, he replied. Complicate? Adeline almost smiled, because complication was exactly what she was building. 2 days later, she walked into a small office on the edge of the city. No glass walls, no skyline views, no polished reception desk. Just a narrow hallway, a flickering light, and a nameplate that read, Arthur Bell. Inside, the man himself looked exactly like the office suggested. Late 60s, wrinkled suit, stacks of paper that didn't seem organized in any way that made sense. "You're Adeline," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Sit down." She did. He didn't ask about the marriage, didn't ask about emotions. He flipped through the documents she handed him, his expression unreadable. "They're going to push hard," he said after a moment. "You understand that, right?" Adeline nodded. "I do." Arthur leaned back. "And you still want to accept their terms?" "Yes." He studied her for a long second, longer than most people ever did. "You're not as simple as they think," he said quietly. Adeline didn't respond, because she didn't need to. Arthur closed the folder slowly. "All right," he said. Then we'll give them exactly what they expect." Across the city, Calvin sat in a conference room surrounded by his legal team. "They're weak," one of his attorneys said confidently. "Her representation is minimal." Calvin smirked. "I told you," he replied. "She won't fight." "Then we push the waiver clause," another added. "Full separation, no future claims. We lock everything now." Calvin nodded. "Do it." That was the moment the trap closed. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. Back in his office, Arthur Bell made a single call. "She agreed?" Margaret Hale's voice asked on the other end. Arthur glanced toward Adeline, who sat calmly, hands folded in her lap. "Yes," he replied. "She played it perfectly." Margaret paused. "Then we proceed." Arthur hung up and looked at Adeline again. They think you're walking in unprepared," he said. Adeline stood slowly. "No," she replied. "They think I already lost." Arthur gave a faint, knowing nod, and somewhere between their silence and Calvin's confidence, the outcome had already been decided. He just didn't know it yet. The courtroom felt colder the second time. Or maybe Adeline just felt it differently now. Everything was exactly as expected. Calvin sat confidently at his table, surrounded by sharp suits and expensive confidence. His legal team spoke in clear, polished tones, presenting arguments that sounded clean, logical, and completely in his favor. Across the room, Adeline sat beside Arthur Bell, quiet, unimpressive, forgettable, exactly as planned. "Your Honor," Calvin's lead attorney began, "this is a straightforward dissolution. Both parties have agreed to a full separation of assets, with no future claims." Straightforward. That word echoed. Adeline kept her eyes forward. Because nothing about this was simple, but everything about it looked that way. Arthur didn't object, didn't interrupt. He simply adjusted his glasses and remained silent. That silence worked better than any argument. It confirmed what everyone already believed, that Adeline wasn't going to fight. The judge turned her attention to her. "Ms. Brooks," she said, "you understand that by signing this agreement, you are permanently waiving any claim to Mr. Rhodes's current and future assets?" A pause. The room leaned in again, waiting, hoping for something dramatic, something emotional. But Adeline gave them nothing. "Yes, Your Honor," she said calmly. I understand." A few quiet chuckles echoed in the back of the room. Vanessa smiled, leaning slightly toward Calvin. "I almost feel bad for her," she whispered. Calvin didn't respond. He was watching Adeline now, trying to read something in her expression. But there was nothing to read, just stillness. Controlled, deliberate. Very well, the judge continued. Then this court recognizes the agreement as binding. The sound of papers being moved filled the silence. Pens slid across documents, signatures placed where they needed to be. Final, permanent. Calvin signed first, quick, confident, like a man closing a deal he had already won. Adeline signed second, slow, precise, like someone who understood exactly what she was doing. Arthur placed the final document forward. And just like that, it was done. 10 years, reduced to ink on paper. Calvin leaned back, exhaling in satisfaction. It didn't have to be this way, he said quietly, not looking at her. Adeline stood, gathering her things. You're right, she replied. He glanced up slightly. For the first time? Curious, but she didn't explain, didn't stay, didn't give him anything more, because the truth was already written into the agreement he had just signed. And by the time he understood it, it wouldn't matter anymore, because in that courtroom, where everyone believed she had just lost everything, Adeline Brooks had just secured her victory, and no one there, even for a second, had realized it. Calvin didn't celebrate immediately, not in a loud way. That wasn't his style. Victory, to him, was something quieter, something controlled. But it was still there, clear in the way he walked out of the courthouse, but clear in the way people looked at him. Respect, approval, even admiration. Vanessa slipped her arm through his as they stepped outside, sunlight cutting across the steps. Well, she said lightly, that was easier than I expected. Calvin smirked. I told you, he replied. She was never going to fight. Vanessa glanced back briefly toward the doors. Still, she added, it's kind of sad. Calvin didn't turn around. Don't confuse silence with strength, he said. Some people just don't have anything to stand on. Across the street, a black car idled quietly. Adeline stood beside it, watching. Not them, just the moment. Then she opened the door and stepped inside. The car pulled away without drawing attention. No one noticed. Back on the steps, Calvin checked his phone. Messages flooded in. Congrats. Clean break? Well played. He responded to a few, short, confident, already moving forward. I've got something bigger tonight, he said to Vanessa as they walked toward his car. The deal I told you about, it's almost done. Her eyes lit up. The one with the private fund? Calvin nodded. Yeah, they're ready to move. He didn't mention the pressure, didn't mention the numbers that had been tightening around him for weeks, because now he believed he had cleared the last obstacle. No complications, no liabilities, no one left who could interfere. Later that afternoon, he sat in his office, the Chicago skyline stretching behind him. A contract lay open on the table. Acquisition terms, investment structure, a way out. He picked up his Mont Blanc pen, tapping it lightly against the page. This is it, he said to his partner on the call. Once this closes, everything resets. His partner hesitated. Are you sure about the counterparty? He asked. They're unusually quiet. Calvin smiled. That's how real money moves, he replied. No noise, no questions, just execution. He ended the call and looked back at the contract. Didn't read every line, didn't feel the need to. Because confidence, when it goes unchecked, feels exactly like certainty, and certainty can be the most dangerous illusion of all. Calvin signed his name at the bottom of the page, firm, decisive, final, believing he had just secured his future. believing he had just won, not realizing the deal he had just committed to wasn't saving him. It was positioning him exactly where someone else needed him to be. And this time, he had no idea who he was really dealing with. Calvin thought the deal was moving forward, clean, controlled, exactly how he liked it. What he didn't know was that someone else had already been watching long before he signed anything. Ethan Cole didn't sit in luxury offices. He didn't attend galas, and he didn't care about appearances. From his desk in a federal building overlooking downtown Chicago, the skyline looked smaller, less impressive, like something that could be taken apart piece by piece if you knew where to look. And Ethan did. He leaned back in his chair, reviewing a file that had been growing for months. Calvin Rhodes. At first glance, it looked like a typical case. Aggressive financial behavior, over-leveraged positions, possible misrepresentation. Nothing unusual, until it was. "Run that again," Ethan said, and then tapping the screen. His colleague frowned. "We already checked those transfers," she replied. "They're fragmented, no direct link." Ethan didn't look away. "They're not random," he said quietly. "They're structured." That was the difference. Anyone could hide money. But structure? That required intention. He pulled up another set of records. Different accounts, different timelines, same pattern. Someone had been moving pieces carefully. Too carefully. And Calvin, for all his confidence, wasn't that precise. "Then who is?" his colleague asked. Ethan didn't answer right away, because he didn't know. Not yet, but he knew this much. Calvin wasn't the only player in this game, and whoever else was involved was smarter. Later that night, Ethan stood outside the Drake Hotel, watching guests move in and out beneath soft golden lights. His eyes didn't follow the crowd. They focused on details, timing, movement, patterns. A black car pulled up across the street, unmarked, unnoticed. But Ethan noticed. The door opened. A woman stepped out. Simple coat, calm posture, no security, no display, just presence. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. Something about her didn't fit. Not with the way she moved. Not with the way the driver waited. She paused for half a second before entering the building. And in that moment, Ethan saw it. Not weakness, not uncertainty. Control. The kind that doesn't need to prove itself. He glanced down at the file still open on his phone. Adeline Brooks, ex-wife, recently divorced, no significant assets, at least. That's what the record said. Ethan looked back toward the hotel entrance, then back at the file. And for the first time, he felt something shift. Because if there was one thing he trusted more than paperwork, it was instinct. And his instinct told him one thing clearly. The story he had been reading was missing its most important part, and the woman everyone thought had lost everything might be the only one who actually knew how this was going to end. The ballroom at the Drake Hotel shimmered with quiet luxury. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors. Soft music floated through the air, blending with the low hum of conversations between people who measured success in numbers most would never understand. Calvin Rhodes stood at the center of it all, confident, composed, exactly where he believed he belonged. A glass of champagne rested in his hand, untouched, as he greeted investors and clients one by one. His smile was effortless, his voice controlled, every word placed carefully. "This is just the beginning," he said to a group gathered near the bar. "We're restructuring at a higher level, bigger opportunities, cleaner positions." They nodded, impressed, because everything about him suggested stability. Vanessa moved beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her presence adding just enough glamour to complete the picture. "You were right," she whispered. "This feels different." Calvin glanced around the room. "It is," he replied, and in that moment, he believed it. Across the ballroom, a smaller group stood near the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Among them was an older investor, Harrison Cole, watching quietly. He didn't smile, didn't engage. He simply observed. When Calvin approached, Harrison gave a slight nod. "You're moving fast," Harrison said. Calvin smiled. "Timing matters." Harrison's gaze didn't shift. "It does," he agreed. "But so does understanding who you're dealing with." Calvin's expression tightened, just slightly. "I've done my research," he replied. Harrison studied him for a moment longer, then said quietly, "Make sure it's enough." Calvin let out a short laugh. "It always is." But as he walked away, something in that exchange lingered. Not doubt, not yet, just a subtle disruption in his certainty. At the entrance, the doors remained closed. Guests continued arriving, names announced, laughter rising, the energy building, everything moving exactly as it should. And then the room shifted, not because of a sound, not because of an announcement, but because attention, without warning, moved, subtly at first, then all at once, toward the entrance. Calvin turned, frowning slightly, because something about the room had changed. The doors hadn't even opened yet, but the atmosphere had, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt it. A pause, a break, like something unseen had just stepped into the space. And whatever it wasn't there for him. It was there, to end everything he thought he had just secured. The doors opened without announcement. No name, no introduction. Just a quiet shift in the air, as if the room itself had made space before anyone understood why. Adeline Brooks stepped inside. The same woman who had stood in a courtroom days earlier, overlooked, dismissed, reduced to something small. But nothing about her felt small now. The coat was gone. In its place, a tailored silhouette, clean and precise. Not loud, not excessive, just unmistakable. Power without explanation. Conversations didn't stop immediately. They slowed, voices softened, eyes turned. Because something about her didn't match the story they had already accepted. Calvin stared. At first, confusion, then irritation. "What is she doing here?" Vanessa whispered, her grip tightening slightly around his arm. Calvin didn't answer. He stepped forward instead, cutting through the space between them. "Adeline," he said sharply, keeping his voice controlled. "This is a private event." She stopped a few steps away, close enough to hear him, far enough to remain untouchable. "I know," she replied calmly. Her voice hadn't changed. That unsettled him more than anything. Vanessa let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "This is unbelievable," she said. "Do you need help finding the exit?" Adeline didn't look at her, not even for a second, because Vanessa didn't matter. Calvin's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be here," he said. A simple statement, but underneath it, a crack. Small, barely visible, but real. Adeline met his eyes, for the first time that night, fully. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said. The words didn't rise, they settled, and that was enough to shift something deeper in the room. Across the ballroom, Margaret Hale stepped forward quietly, exchanging a brief glance with Adeline before turning toward the event coordinator. No announcement, still no explanation. But the structure of the night had already begun to change. Calvin felt it now, not clearly, not logically, but instinctively. "This isn't funny," he said, his voice lower now. "Whatever you think you're doing—" Adeline didn't interrupt, didn't react. She simply took one step past him, then another, walking toward the center of the room, toward the table where the contracts waited, where the deal he believed would save him was about to be finalized. Behind him, Vanessa frowned. "Why is no one stopping her?" she whispered. But no one moved, because something had already shifted beyond control. Calvin turned slowly, watching her, trying to understand, trying to regain ground he didn't realize he had already lost. And in that moment, for the first time, the man who had laughed in the courtroom didn't feel like he was winning anymore. Adeline didn't rush. She didn't need to. Every step she took across the ballroom felt measured, intentional, like she had already walked this moment 100 times in her mind. The conversations around her faded, not because people were told to be quiet, but because something about her presence demanded it. At the center of the room, the contract table stood ready, polished, prepared, waiting. Margaret Hale was already there. She didn't greet Adeline like a guest. She acknowledged her like authority. "Everything is in place," Margaret said quietly. Adeline nodded once. "Good." That was all. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Behind them, Calvin approached, his composure slipping just enough to notice. "This stops now," he said sharply. "You don't belong in this process." Margaret turned first, her expression calm, professional. "And you are?" she asked. Calvin blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Margaret didn't repeat herself. She simply held his gaze, waiting. "I'm the one closing this deal," Calvin said, his voice tightening. Margaret glanced briefly at Adeline, then back at him. "No," she replied. "You're the one signing it." Silence fell. He frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" Adeline reached for the contract. Not quickly, not dramatically, just naturally, like it had always been hers to touch. "You should read it again," she said. Calvin let out a short laugh. "I've read it," he replied. "Multiple times." Adeline looked at him, and for the first time, there was something unmistakable in her eyes. Not anger, not hurt, clarity. "Then you should have understood it," she said. Margaret opened the document to a marked page, sliding it toward him. "Section 9, she added. Calvin glanced down, warm irritation turning into focus as his eyes scanned the text. Then paused. His expression changed, just slightly. "What is this?" he asked. Margaret's voice remained even. "Full liability transfer upon execution," she said. "All financial exposure remains with current ownership until restructuring is complete." Calvin looked up. "That's standard," he said quickly. Adeline didn't respond. Margaret continued. "Read the next line." He did, slower this time, more carefully, and that's when it hit him. The language, the structure, the control. "This isn't an acquisition," he said, not a question, a realization. Adeline stepped closer, now standing directly across from him. "No," she replied softly. "It's not." The room felt different now, heavier, tighter, because the deal he thought would save him was something else entirely. And for the first time, Calvin wasn't looking at his ex-wife. He was looking at someone he didn't understand. Someone who had been standing in front of him the entire time and had never been who he thought she was. Calvin read the line again, then again, as if repetition alone might change what it meant. But it didn't. The words stayed exactly the same. Cold, precise, unforgiving. This clause, he said slowly, looking up at Margaret. This shifts all unresolved liabilities back to the current owner before restructuring. Margaret didn't move. Correct? Calvin shook his head, a sharp laugh escaping under his breath. That's not how acquisitions work, he said. No buyer would agree to that. Adeline finally stepped closer. Close enough now that there was no distance left to hide behind. You're right, she said calmly. He met her eyes, confused, frustrated, then uneasy. Because this was never a purchase, she continued. Silence spread across the room. Not curiosity anymore, not interest. Tension. Real tension. Calvin straightened. What are you saying? He demanded. Adeline didn't rush her answer. She let the weight of the moment settle first. Let him feel it. This is a disclosure agreement, she said. The words landed heavier than anything before them. Margaret turned the next page. Forensic review authorization, she added, signed voluntarily upon execution. Calvin's expression shifted again, faster this time. That's standard due diligence. No, Margaret interrupted. This grants full access to all financial records, past and present. A pause. Then, and it locks those records in as legally admissible. The room went still, completely. Because now, people understood. Not fully, but enough. Calvin looked down at the document again. This time, not as a deal, as a trap. You set this up, he said quietly. Not to Margaret, to Adeline. She didn't deny it, didn't soften it. I gave you exactly what you asked for, she replied. A clean structure, no interference. His breathing changed, subtle, but real. You knew? He said. Yes. How long? Adeline held his gaze. Long enough. That was the moment everything collapsed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Because Calvin finally understood. Every step he had taken, every decision he thought was his, had been guided, positioned, anticipated. You can't do this, he said, his voice lower now. You don't have the authority. Margaret didn't respond. She didn't need to, because Adeline already had, and in a room full of people who once laughed at her. The truth was no longer hidden. It was unfolding, and there was nothing left he could do to stop it. No, Adeline said quietly, and that one word stopped everything. Calvin stared at her, his confidence unraveling in real time. You don't get to say no, he snapped. You think walking in here changes anything? You're still... He stopped himself. Too late, because now everyone was watching, not with admiration, but with something else. Doubt. Margaret stepped forward, her voice cutting clean through the tension. Mr. Rhodes, she said, you're misunderstanding your position. Calvin let out a short, bitter laugh. No, he replied. I think I understand it perfectly. Then allow me to clarify, Margaret continued. She nodded toward the far end of the room. Two men stepped forward. Not investors, not guests. Their presence was different, measured, official. Ethan Cole stood between them. Calvin's expression shifted instantly. Recognition. What is this? He demanded. Ethan didn't rush, didn't posture. He simply reached into his jacket and placed a folder on the table. Financial review documentation, he said, connected to accounts under your control. Calvin's voice tightened. You have no authority here. Ethan met his gaze. I do now. The room went completely silent, because the illusion was gone. Margaret turned another page in the contract. As outlined, she said, execution of this agreement grants full legal access to all associated financial activity. Ethan added calmly, And we've already started reviewing it. Calvin looked around, at the faces, at the investors, at Vanessa, who had taken a step back without realizing it. You planned this, he said, his voice lower now. Not angry anymore, cornered. Adeline didn't move, didn't raise her voice. Yes, she said, a breath, then another. Calvin's composure collapsed in layers. You set me up. No, Adeline replied. You walked into it. That hit harder, because it was true. Margaret closed the folder. Mr. Rhodes, you now have 2 options, she said. Calvin didn't respond. He didn't need to, because he already understood. Sign the agreement, she continued, and transfer all liabilities and assets as outlined, or we proceed with a full federal investigation. Ethan didn't add anything. He didn't have to. His presence was enough. The room held its breath. Because this wasn't negotiation anymore. This was consequence. Calvin looked down at the pen in front of him. The same kind he had used so many times before. To close deals, to assert control. Now, it felt different. He picked it up slowly, and for the first time, he hesitated, because this signature would cost him everything. Calvin held the pen in his hand. For years, that simple object had meant control, power, authority. Now, it felt like a weight he couldn't lift. The room waited. No one spoke, no one moved, because everyone understood what this moment was. Not a deal, not a negotiation, an ending. Vanessa took another step back, her expression no longer amused, no longer confident, just uncertain. This is insane, she whispered. Calvin, don't sign that. But her voice didn't carry the same certainty it had before, because even she could feel it now. The shift, the collapse. Calvin didn't look at her. He couldn't, because if he did, he might see exactly what everyone else already had, that she wasn't standing beside him anymore. She was already distancing herself from the fall. You're making a mistake, he said, looking at Adeline. His voice was quieter now, not commanding, not superior, just desperate. Adeline didn't react, because this wasn't about convincing him. It never had been. It was always your decision, she said calmly. Calvin laughed under his breath, a broken sound. No, he replied. You made sure of that. Adeline tilted her head slightly. You wanted control, she said. I gave it to you. The truth landed harder than any accusation, because deep down, he knew it was real. Every clause, every signature, every step. He had chosen. And now, there was no one left to blame. Ethan stood silently, watching. Not with judgment, not with satisfaction, just clarity. Because this wasn't revenge, it was consequence. Calvin's grip tightened around the pen. His eyes moved across the contract one last time, but he wasn't reading it anymore. He was remembering. Every shortcut, every risk, every moment he thought he could outmaneuver the system. And every moment he underestimated the woman standing in front of him. Slowly. He lowered the pen to the page. Signed. The sound was almost nothing, just ink on paper. But it echoed louder than anything else that night, because in that single movement, he gave up everything, his company, his assets, his image, his future. Vanessa turned away, didn't wait, didn't speak, just walked, and didn't look back. Calvin sat there, staring at the signature, at his name, now tied to something irreversible. Adeline stepped back, not closer, not victorious, just finished. Because this was never about destroying him. It was about letting him face exactly what he had built. And now, there was nothing left to protect him from it. The city didn't change. Chicago still moved the same way, fast, bright, indifferent. Cars rushed past. Lights reflected off glass towers. People chased things they believed would finally make them feel complete. But Adeline Brooks was no longer chasing anything. Weeks had passed since that night. The headlines came and went. Financial collapse, internal investigation, investor recovery. Calvin Rhodes became a name spoken carefully, quietly, like a warning. Adeline never responded to any of it. She didn't need to, because the outcome had already spoken for itself. Inside a quiet conference room overlooking Lake Michigan, she sat across from a small group of investors. Not to dominate, not to impress, but to restore. Every affected account will be made whole, she said calmly. No exceptions. There were no dramatic reactions, just relief, real, human relief, because for them, this wasn't about power, it was about being protected, and for Adeline, that mattered more than winning ever could. Later that afternoon, she stepped outside. The air was colder now, sharper, but cleaner somehow. Ethan Cole stood near the edge of the sidewalk, hands in his coat pockets, not waiting, just there. "You didn't have to stay," she said as she approached. Ethan gave a small shrug. "I wasn't here for the case," he replied. Adeline glanced at him. "No?" He shook his head. "I was here for the truth." A quiet pause settled between them. Different from before. Lighter. Honest. "You already knew," she said. Ethan nodded. "Not everything," he admitted, "but enough to know you weren't who they thought you were." Adeline looked out toward the water. For a long moment, she didn't speak, because for the first time in years, she didn't have to calculate her next move, didn't have to hide, didn't have to prove anything. "I spent a long time being invisible," she said softly. Ethan turned slightly toward her. "And now?" Adeline allowed herself a small breath, a real one. "Now I get to choose what I'm seen for." Ethan smiled, not wide, not forced, just genuine. They stood there a moment longer. No urgency, no pressure, just space and possibility. Behind them, the city kept moving. Ahead of them, something new began. Not built on illusion, not driven by fear, but chosen. And this time, Adeline wasn't surviving someone else's world. She was finally living in her own. So, that's how the story comes to an end. And hey, if you're still here with me right now, then I believe something in this story touched you. Maybe not loudly, but in a quiet, personal way. Let's just talk for a second. Honestly, life doesn't always hurt us in big, dramatic moments. Sometimes it's the slow kind of pain, being overlooked, underestimated, or made to feel like we don't matter. And like Adeline, many of us stay silent, not because we're weak, but because we're learning, watching, preparing. There's a line from Stoic philosophy that says, "The best revenge is to be unlike the one who performed the injury." And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not to destroy others, but to build yourself so strong that nothing they did can define you anymore. You don't need to prove your worth to people who already decided not to see it. You just need to become someone who no longer needs their validation. So if this story stayed with you, take a moment. Like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes, the right story finds you at the right time. And maybe this was yours. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. While it explores realistic themes such as relationships, financial decisions, personal growth, and legal consequences, all characters, events, and situations are imagined and not based on any real individuals or verified cases. Certain elements, especially legal and financial processes, have been simplified or adapted to enhance the emotional flow of the story and may not reflect exact real-world procedures. This content is not intended to provide legal, financial, or professional advice. Viewer discretion is encouraged, and outcomes in real life may vary significantly. The purpose of this story is to inspire reflection, emotional connection, and personal empowerment, not to present factual claims or real-life guidance.